All right, everyone, it is 2 o'clock. So I say let's go ahead and get started. Yahoo! So welcome to the proposed framework for the evaluation of academic librarian scholarship. That is quite a mouthful. I am Rachel, and joined by Jennifer, Polly, and Sigrid. We'll explain who we are and why we're here. Before we dive into things, just a note that we do have a shared note-taking document. If you would like to contribute, please do. If you just want to use it after the conference or at any point, do that too. But we thought if we all take notes together, we end up with better notes. So why not? And this helps us too, because we need these notes to go back and refine things later. So, quick overview of what we're going to be doing today. We're going to talk about who we are representing and what our goal was with our task force, some of the work and background that we did and what we learned from it, and then the actual meat of why we're here, introduce the framework that we established as a result of our work, and then we hope to leave lots of time for the lively part of this lively discussion to get your thoughts and feedback and engage in conversation about the framework. So before we do that, we are going to do a quick warm-up icebreaker to kind of get us all in a similar mindset. And also, liven it up, it is post-lunch, right? So, what we want you to do is to think back on a professional presentation, perhaps at Charleston, perhaps somewhere else, that had an impact on you. And try to remember what it was and why it's come into your mind, and maybe what kind of impact it had. So we'll just take a few seconds. And here are some thoughts about possible ways that it may have impacted you as a professional. Perhaps it impacted your day-to-day responsibilities as a practitioner. Perhaps it ended up informing your future scholarship, your research publications, or other research outputs. Or maybe there was some other type of impact entirely. The presenter who snorted when she laughed way too often. So, the next question is, now that we all have that thought, that presentation in mind, how would those presenters know that? How would they be made aware of the impact they had on you? So let's take a moment to think of some ways they do know or could know. And we're going to do the old instructional think, pair, share. So I'd like for you to turn to someone nearby and discuss what you came up with.
So as far as the feedback, I just thought of a survey. Usually after you go to a conference,
you go up to the person afterwards. You get a lot of questions, like,
right.
I remember botching forms, you get no questions.
Yeah, that's the worst.
Normally, the goal is to check the road, like, if you really enjoyed it, everything. Never really, I know it's never like, but we don't like and then as far as the reverse questions, it's like, no, last time. But I know we really like take another minute or so.
I was starting like the one that I thought of that actually has stuck with me and I really brought it up to other people was this the keynote speaker at our consortium event last year. Actually a business professor at Harvard, and they talked about I guess it was just on diversity and inclusion, but it was like also really interesting.
All right, let's wrap up our current thoughts so we don't get too lost.
Like there were a lot of surprises along the way. Yeah, he would show Okay, what do you think of this picture?
All right,
Like,
I'm hearing in general wrapping up. Now, let's talk about what you guys came up with. What are some examples of ways in which the presenters know about the impact that they had on you? Uh-oh, did anyone talk about it? In the back, please.
I saw a presentation today and people were taking business cards from this person who was giving the talk, and so maybe like the less business cards they have, the more impactful they might be, and the sales that come afterwards might indicate that.
Okay, so people taking business cards. I'm going to repeat just because we are being recorded and only the mic's really going to get picked up. People taking business cards after a presentation, so perhaps the more business cards picked up, the more, in this case, business, or the more impact generally. Great. Of course, we have to count our business cards. Other thoughts?
If we actually follow up and contact the presenters and let them know, how they impacted us.
Yep, contacting the presenters, that's definitely something I've done before. Hey, I liked your idea. Tell me more. Maybe we want to do it too. Sure, emails are great. Other thoughts? Yes?
There's often a feedback survey after the conference, and it has each individual presentation and rate each one.
Yes, feedback survey, that good old word assessment, closing the loop, but it is really useful in this case for discovering what that impact may have been. Though a more immediate form of impact, right, than emails. Yes?
I've often tweeted someone's presentation and let them know that it was really impactful.
Yeah, tweeting their presentation, letting them know, even if it gets retweeted, if it generates discussion online. Absolutely, those are all good evidence that you're making a difference in some way. Great, any others? All right, well, you guys have come up with some great ones that hopefully we will see reflected in the framework, but some of this type of impact forms the basis for why we are here presenting to you today. In thinking of different ways in which we as librarians impact each other, some of which are well documented and some of which aren't always. So, who are we? Why are we talking about this? We are the Impactful Scholarship and Metrics Task Force. We are an ACRL task force, and this is our charge. But our charge was essentially to create a framework to recommend effective practices while acknowledging that we all have very different scholarly expectations at our individual institutions, and to encourage impactful scholarship and routes of documenting impact. Take a few seconds in case you want to read the whole thing. Okay, so what were our goals with this framework? We had pretty lofty goals. So we wanted to take a look at current institutional expectations regarding scholarship for librarians and try and reflect them in our framework to acknowledge a pretty wide range of potential research outputs, because again, we do have very different expectations at our institutions. We wanted to give librarians more ways to measure the impact of their scholarship, both directly and indirectly, in line with what we just talked about, and to most importantly start conversations at individual institutions of how can we better align our own individual practices in our institutions. Do we need to review and revise our guidelines or other official documentation? So this is what we're hoping our framework will help with. So how did we create this framework? Part one, we gathered as much information as we could. So we split up into 3 sub-teams, and these were our main goals for the sub-teams. One, we wanted to know, are other disciplines doing something like this already? Do we have to create the wheel, or can we steal it from someone else? So we looked at a whole bunch of disciplinary society documentation, primarily, to see what kind of guidance is given by disciplinary societies. Next, we looked at your institutional documentation. Not everyone's, but we did try and gather a wide variety of institutional documentation to see what are the current expectations for academic librarian scholarship and how is impact handled within those guidelines. And finally, we sent out a big old survey. We had over 500 responses and asked academic librarians about their various thoughts and attitudes regarding scholarship. for academic librarians. And what did we learn from all this? This is a highly abbreviated version. At the end, there'll be a link to, we did a presentation at ACRL conference in April? Yeah, that had more detailed results. So if you are curious about some of the more granular details, you'll have a link to those. But these are some of the main things that ended up influencing our framework. If anyone's familiar with the Becker model, it is the only framework we can find. It's from biomedicine, and it divides scholarly impact into 5 distinct impact areas, which are listed there. Obviously specific to biomedical, but did serve as a start. So we didn't have to entirely recreate this concept of a framework. Additionally, several institutions referred to Ernst Boyer's categories of scholarship, which again break down scholarship into different types of scholarship. Overall, looking at institutional documentation, there were very few specifics about impact. Most of the documentation was about types of research outputs rather than impact. But we did see that peer review came up over and over again as a general standard for our field in various ways. In particular, peer-reviewed journal articles, but not just journal articles, came up as a preferred method or output, research output. One other thing to note before I turn it over to Jennifer, what we're actually presenting is a second draft of our framework, and it was our second draft was pretty highly influenced by some other ACRL initiatives that happened between the time when we started and the time when we published our first draft. In April, ACRL recommended a standard practice that academic librarians publish in open access venues. This is a pretty big deal, at least in my opinion, and was something that we wanted to make sure we acknowledged in the framework, as well as the idea of open and equitable scholarship. There was another ACRL, it's not a task force, thank you, committee, RESEC, Research and Scholarly Environments, came out with a pretty lengthy set of outlines and recommendations for future scholarship that is ideas for plans to reshape the current system of scholarly communications to increase equity and inclusivity. So in our second draft, we have some language around the framework that acknowledges both of these initiatives and essentially says that institutions need to talk about all three and what our values are with regards to what we're valuing, right? Do we care more about high impact research? Do we care more about open access research? Is it somewhere in the middle, et cetera? We did not feel that we should be the ones saying which one was more important. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to introduce the framework.
So with the framework, again, as Rachel mentioned, we are just mentioning that this is what we are recommending for discussion. So we looked at a wide variety of scholarly research outputs, and we are trying to fit a wide range of what all librarians do. So we're looking at librarians that do scholarly research, we're looking at the practitioner, so we're trying to fit all of that into this framework. All the different varieties of communication, dissemination, the various different institutional standards. So the framework is not meant to say in a prescriptive way that this is what counts when we're looking at this. It's just these are various ways in which you can make research outputs count at your institution. So they're supposed to broaden those categories. And so we decided, because of there's such a wide range, that we wanted to make 2 different categories of impact in the framework. And one is the scholarly impact, which has the more traditional impact measurements, has the citation measurements, citation metrics, acceptance rate, the sort of things that we're very used to seeing. And the other one is for the practitioner impact, which has more qualitative metrics and altmetrics. It's a little bit less traditional, but can be used in complement to the other evidence of impact. Journal level metrics are still evident in the framework. We looked at several different models, including tiers of preferred outlets, peer surveys of core academic librarianship journals, but we didn't feel like it was the task force's responsibility to say these are the core academic journals that should be preferred, that maybe that was a task force at another time that ACRL could put together and come up with that list, or that each institution could come up with that list, but that wasn't our charge. And the framework is very neutral in measurement. Again, maybe ACRL will adopt a survey for future use or standardization, but it's meant to begin as a discussion at each institution based on the framework, but not for us to say this is what you should be doing. The framework itself is meant to frame different possibilities of scholarly evaluation, which is why we are including discussions of the ACRL open access recommendations and the equity and diversion language. And other ways, we're also trying to make it so non-prescriptive that if new metrics come along, that those can be included in your scholarship discussions as well. And here is a link to the full framework, and I believe there's a handout as well at your individual places, so that you have both, so that you can take a look at it. And this is a snippet of what the framework looks like. So you'll see that for journal articles, we still have things in there like citation count, journal acceptance rate, peer review process, for the scholarly impact track, I'll call it. For the practitioner impact, it could be views and downloads, how many times it was shared or mentioned, direct evidence of use, so emails, how much it was included in syllabi or training materials. You can see for conference poster presentations, the size or scope of the conference, whether it was refereed, the attendance at the conference, views and downloads, direct evidence of use, again, shares, mentions, comments. And at this point, we are very interested to hear your questions, your comments, your feedback, because every time we've done this, we have taken your feedback and have incorporated it and gone back and sort of retooled what we've looked at. And so we're very, very interested in hearing from you. Yes. Did I read the first question? I can let you go through that? Yeah.
Okay, so we have some questions up here, and I'll also take some questions from you all, and I will repeat them into the mic so they get picked up. So the first one, how do you envision the framework being used at your institution?
Or you can explain it to your personal.
I mean, we would start trying to have it be part of our probably promotion guidelines. We have faculty status but not tenure, and have promotion guidelines that include a bucket for scholarship, but it's hard to define what is what, and we really have a hard time getting provosts, et cetera, to understand that our scholarship looks different from psychologists and chemists. So having something that is a national, let's just say, standard to be in existence to refer to would be beneficial.
Okay, so having a national standard for librarianship would be beneficial for libraries to incorporate into their promotion or promotion and tenure guidelines, whichever they might have at their library, and to explain to the wider university audience how scholarship and librarianship may differ from other disciplines.
And then I guess even on that personal level, we're in the same boat as you. It's hard even within an institution, and even within the library, to explain what I do in my unit versus what you do in your unit. And so maybe having something like this where I could say, well, the poster that we did was downloaded 17 times. Okay, I understand that, but that's a metric that I can get different.
Okay, so even within libraries, scholarship can differ a lot from the archivists to the digital services. So explaining that.
Yes, so we are in a 10-year intensive environment at Texas A&M University. But there's a group of us that so I'm an archivist, and there's a group of us we just presented on earning tenure as archivists, earning promotion and tenure, and so we talked about those very same issues. So this is really valuable in terms of looking at how this can fit into our world in the archives, because some archivists are in tenure track, some aren't.
Okay, so
It
I'm
sounds
gonna
really good.
try to summarize that at a research-intensive institution,
Right,
Texas A&M.
exactly.
The archivists
Yeah.
recently put together, what was it, a document, a guideline, a
Right,
presentation
right,
on what it looks
we-
like to earn tenure as an
Absolutely.
archivist.
And so we've been talking about how do we deal with people who are in promotion positions but are not in tenure track and tenure and everything. So we've been looking at all levels of how to help people in the archival world with these same issues.
Our institution is actually going through the promotion and tenure process across the board for all departments and colleges. They have a working group that they're like, should we start over again and rewrite this whole faculty manual? And so it'd be interesting, even if we don't use anything in this, it's something that we can look to see how other people are doing things, because departments, you often don't see what some people say. If it's a national conference, you get 2 points, some people do the point-based system and things. So it'll be interesting to see that in relation to this and what ACRL sees as kind of stuff.
Okay, so this is an institution that's looking at the faculty handbook and promotion guidelines across the whole institution. So this document on librarianship could also inform that.
So, to the point of a national standard, I think that would be really useful, but this isn't really that, is it? And this is just creating possibilities.
Right, no, this is not meant to present a standard, but a framework for each institution to refer to when maybe adopting their own standards.
Right. So, however, go ahead, you want to respond to that? It makes it hard for us as a profession to make any sort of case about research in librarianship when we don't have any kind of more uniform standards. Most of you, I think, have probably heard of academic analytics, right? It's a subscription-based service that many universities use to compare the performances of their disciplines with others across the country. Academic analytics doesn't cover librarianship. Why? Because they can't. Because we all report so differently and we don't have this kind of standard. The other things I think we need to get away from this idea of saying that we're so different even within our institution or within our libraries. That's true across campuses, right? Research is just conducted differently in different disciplines, but it all has to go up to generally a single campus-wide committee for review. So it's up to us to make a case for why the research matters and what impact it has had. We're not any different in that regard than other disciplines.
I'm going to try to summarize that. That's okay. So you talked about how academic analytics does not capture librarian scholarship because we are so hard to track ourselves,
Because we don't have a
and that
standard.
there really is no standard. And then you also talked about how this is not a librarian exclusive problem of having to make the case for impact. That's something many departments at many campuses struggle with, which I agree with. One thing I was going to say about a standard is one of the things that we did was to review all the documents that we could find, and we got IRB approval for that process to summarize. And I keep struggling with, could we just release all of the things that we found? And I don't know if that's within IRB or not, but it does strike me as something that is necessary, is just to make all of this way more findable. And even within our review, time and time we're like, is this the best document to be looking at? This seems to cover everyone on campus. Are librarians included in this? Is there a more specific document that has more specifics about types of outputs? other than this is what's needed generally to go up for tenure, those kinds of questions still remain for us, and we're definitely a limitation in being able to say, we definitely found the full range of expectations, because so many of them were so vague. And I suspect that there's a lot of culture conversations that happen that are not documented, right? Whether your institution values journal articles or solo authoring above co-authorship, some of those things we got out with the survey, but again, there's an individual librarian's opinion, and then there's how people are actually evaluated at different levels. And I think we still have a lot of work to do. So I think our framework is one piece of that, but I agree that I don't think this will create a national standard. But I think it could help standardize at individual institutions. But I really don't know the future of librarianship if we're all ever going to agree on what is valued, which is just fascinating to me. But those are all things that we kind of grappled with along the way of, should we say, this is how you value a journal within academic librarianship? And as you saw, we thought there's so many different ways to do that, and especially when we're thinking about open and equitable scholarship and not wanting to prioritize traditional methods of scholarship above ones that are new and emerging, that we didn't feel like that made sense. So I think there are some good reasons that there aren't standards, but it also at times does us a disservice as well. Sorry, that was a lot of thoughts.
Question, did you find anything, I'm thinking about fine arts faculty who, for their tenure promotion often have to produce a show, or it's very different from journal articles or scholarly monographs. Did you find any kind of standards related to fine arts?
So the question was, did we look for or find standards for fine arts? We weren't really looking for standards, we were looking for frameworks.
Or frameworks, any kind of documentation?
Like Rachel said on the earlier slide, was the biomedical, was that it?
Right.
Yeah.
Was really the only one we could find. But related to fine arts, libraries often have exhibits, and exhibits are listed as an output in the framework, so that would be something comparable to norm.
And I would have to go back and look. We found, I think, around 15 different scholarly societies that had, we found about 15 scholarly societies that had produced something that related to the evaluation of research outputs, creative, whatever you want to call this category of things that faculty do. I don't remember off the top of my head if any of them were in the fine arts, but I know several of them were in the humanities. And the kinds of statements that were made were pretty variable. That's like for humanities, digital humanities was one of the common themes that emerged through a few different, like American Historical Society had one talking about how should we value digital scholarship in the evaluation of faculty. I don't remember one specifically for fine arts.
Well, that's something that digital humanists struggle with, this same question, too.
Yes. I think as a general categorization, I would say that most disciplinary societies are not exactly up to date with their recommendations, and if they do, they tend to be pretty large and not to the level of I can take this and apply it, which was more what we were looking for. So I think that there probably are some statements that could be applied to creative works. That's about as prescriptive or granular as they got.
Any other questions or comments?
I make a comment about views and downloads.
Okay.
I think we have to be really careful about those because we do not have a good or standardized way of counting views and downloads.
Right.
Google Analytics is very good at counting views of HTML pages, horrible at counting downloads. And if your administrators are using log files, then they're probably way inflating because there's so much robot traffic in log files to count downloads.
Yeah, so the comment is views and downloads is not necessarily an accurate measure of impact. Google Analytics and log file analysis aren't always accurate. I would add too that a lot of
publishers might have a little download all button on their interface just so that they can tell the libraries they get a lot more downloads. So, you know, there's ways that it's in the publisher's interest to inflate those downloads as well. So you have to watch out for whether that's really a good measure of impact.
I always have comments. I have two thoughts on that. One, NISO has an altmetrics standard, for lack of a better term. It's a pretty wide-ranging report, and one of the major issues tackled was standardization of altmetrics, including views and downloads, towards standardization of how we can equitably track views and downloads so that they are more trustworthy. The extent to which that has been adopted, I don't know, but I think it's mostly confined to altmetric publishers, PubMax, Impact Story, things like that, altmetric. The other thought is that there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem that I think we haven't standardized more because scholars haven't said we need this. And that part of my hope will be releasing recommendations along with our framework, and one is going to be, we need better systems if we are going to value these metrics. We're only one task force, we can't change the world, but you know, my hope is that if we say having these metrics is useful, that it then encourages, especially in our case, academic librarian publishers to figure out ways to make that visible and reliable.
So as far as downloads are concerned, just looking at the list of measures that you have in the third column, that's really the only one that's an output. It's not an outcome. You can download it. I mean, I have 9 million articles that I've downloaded and never looked at. So all of these the things that are kind of equating, you know, citation, even getting an email from someone saying they've read it, those to me are different types of evidence of use. A download is just, it's, you know, input, it's an output rather than an outcome. So I'm cautious about putting too much stock in. There's a reason why faculty have not really started to demand that publishers do a better job, because it just doesn't matter to most faculty.
So the comment is that views and downloads are outputs rather than outcomes, where most of the other things in the practitioner column would be more outcome-based, and that there's a reason that that essentially views and downloads are not super important and don't tell a big story. I think I would push back against that a little bit and say that there are some disciplinary differences, and I think of disciplines, we're one of the ones where it could be way more useful. That if I go back to the Charleston website in a month and see that 1,000 people have downloaded this presentation, that tells me something, I think. Because of the nature of the presentation, I'm not expecting people to ever cite this, right? It is really an applied presentation, and a lot of what we do is pretty applied as practitioners in addition to scholars. So I think we're not unique, but the extent to which our scholarship is informed by our practice, I would argue is fairly unique among the disciplines, and that is part of why we added it. That so much of what we do is not cited, but is used. And I don't think a single number tells you everything, but it says something. We don't know how people or why people are downloading it, but the fact that it is getting download is an indicator, I think. And that's some of the, what we have in the introduction section says these are designed to be complementary.
Yeah.
And I think that's the main reason why we have it there. But thank you for that.
You know, I'm not saying throw it out, I hesitate to put too much stock in.
I would probably say that of anything that's in that category. I would not rely, you know, on any one of those, but I think when I think about metrics, I think about telling a story. And I think that the more little pieces that you have, the better the story becomes. That's what my goal is anyway, is to help all of us tell better stories about what we do.
Yeah, I think that practitioner thing is just a useful thing to introduce into the framework. And I'm sorry, I introduced the word standard into the room. It was my fault. I shouldn't have done it. But just having that as a category under the framework, I think helps explain it differently to faculty outside of our discipline on campus. that's something I can think of our people in the College of Education who are always fighting this battle with the provost about how they demonstrate their impact. And it doesn't look to the provost like she thinks it should look like. And it's this constant thing I know between the two disciplines of, this is impact, well, but it doesn't look like I expect impact to look like. So even just calling it something like differentiating between scholarship and practitioner-based outputs, even if it's not outcomes, even if it's just outputs, helps people understand it better.
Okay, so to summarize what you just said for the recording is that it is useful to have the two different categories, practitioner, scholarship, partly to explain to other disciplines or provosts in the larger university community who might not always think about impact in that way. Comparison was made to education.
Sorry, I talk a lot. One of the reasons that we wanted to come to Charleston specifically is because we wanted to make sure we were capturing a pretty wide variety of different types of librarians. Most of us are on the, well, I think I'm probably speaking for myself, but I tend to think of the research instruction subject liaison model more because that's what I'm familiar with. So one of my main questions is the work that you do that you would categorize as professional contributions, research, scholarship, if you look at the different categories and different rows, how well do you see what you do lining up with those rows? Are there things that we missed? Or could clarify so that you can more easily fit your research or the work of your field? And just to take an example, archivists. Hi. How well have we captured archivist research and scholarly output in this? Would be super helpful for us to know. And I don't mean to pick on you specifically.
I have a general suggestion. I think we shoot ourselves in the foot a lot in terms of being able to get cited. I can't tell you how many times I find articles written by librarians, PDFs, that have been separated from whatever website or repository they were in, and they had no metadata. They had no way, there's no way to cite the article, right? So if I don't know if this would fit into your framework, but if you could require somehow every librarian to make sure that they put a cover sheet on their PDF with citation information, I think that would help being able to cite and use DOIs. You know, if you use a DOI, it makes it so much easier to cite an article because you can import it into a reference manager.
So the suggestion, tell me if I'm adequately summarizing here, is probably not require, but perhaps we should recommend that academic librarians increase the ways in which they can be tracked by including how to cite this and or DOIs. And I think that's an excellent suggestion, especially as people start to include their personal manuscript copies and you don't know if there's a later published version that's in a journal or is this a white paper. Yeah.
There's no other questions. We can look at some of the ones up on the screen that we didn't get to. How about should reputation/prestige be reflected in the framework? This was something that came up in the recent webinar we did with ACRL. So there was one audience member at least that raised that question, that why we had that in the framework.
And our first version did have that as a category under scholarly impact. It was the reputation or prestige of the journal, of the conference venue, and we took it out from the first draft to the second draft because there were concerns about that. But I know that it's pretty highly used, right? I presented at Charleston, which is a prestigious venue, right? Should we have a way to allow for that or not? Is that something we value, or is it standing in the way of us telling our story?
Does prestige discourage people from publishing in newer open access journals?
Well, I will say that if you are talking about prestige, then you can sometimes lose that other element that you were talking about when inclusivity and diversity. Because there, and I know this even with scholarship, that some people of color who publish in certain journals are not given the same kind of credit for them that if they published in, more of the majority journal. So I think you have to be careful about that, because you can bump up against that very issue. And I would say keep staying away from this is a prestigious, acceptance into this. You can say that acceptance into this particular conference has a particular level in terms of they get 500 applications and you would one of 500. Something like that. And I think if you start with these adjectives, you can move away from the whole notion of inclusivity and diversity.
So the comment was that if prestige and reputation are emphasized too much, it could be at odds with diversity and inclusivity. Maybe scholars of color would be publishing in other venues, not because they're not quote unquote prestigious, but for other reasons, and it could.
I will give an example of that. I was on a tenure committee, and it was for a psychologist who was going up for tenure. And the committee didn't want to accept the fact that certain journals that she was publishing in were related to black psychology, and they didn't see them as prestigious, and we had to really push back on that and say this is very prestigious for this area, which is her area of research. So yeah, it can really be problematic.
Yeah, so the comment was a particular example at an institution where someone was publishing in a specific journal that colleagues didn't think was as well recognized.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we discussed this a little bit as a task force, that reputation and prestige can be important, but it shouldn't take away from an article that's not published in one of those journals. You could imagine an article published in a newer journal, and take that same article and say it was published in a more established journal. It might get more citations just because of where it was published, even if it's the same article. So you have to kind of weigh that and not make it take away from the scholarship too much.
What about more kind of not thinking about prestige or reputation, those are subjective concepts, but more objective measures, like does it employ double blind peer review? Does it have an editorial board? What is the acceptance rate, which can be that's self-reported by the journals, it's very hard to nail down acceptance rate. Yeah, I mean, so like not using the term prestige or reputation, and instead just focusing on the more objective.
So the comment was the word prestige and reputation are somewhat subjective, and we should look at more objective measures such as acceptance rate, whether it's double-blind review, and other measures like that.
That's essentially what we have done with this draft, which is why I pulled it up. Yeah, I guess my question is this enough? Does this feel like we can, document ourselves well with this step?
Is there a question?
I guess my next question is, do you have suggestions for what should change between the draft that's in your hand and the final version? It's also totally okay to tell us it's perfect, that's less work for us.
The section about professional association service, I mean, I think a lot of us would define that broadly, but I think you could spell it out more broadly also in terms of like, I can think of like our consortium that I do a lot of work for isn't really a professional organization, but I spend a lot of time volunteering to do things that benefit other people in the group. But it's not a professional association.
So the comment was that we could broaden the section on service to the profession. We have, I don't have it right in front of me, but we have it listed as scholarly organizations or something like that, but we could make it broader by including things like work for consortia that might not be an official organization.
Statewide committee.
Statewide committees, that kind of service work.
So one thing to keep in mind with what's in front of you, and it's one thing that has sort of thrown just about everybody that's looked at it, is these boxes, and it's the problem with boxes whenever you have them, is that it sort of gives it the appearance of this is all-inclusive and this is the set recommendation group, right? These are really, it's because this is how we chose to represent what's in front of you, but what's in the boxes is not meant to be all-inclusive. It's just supposed to be a set of examples of what you can then take back to your institutions to begin the conversation. So what's there in those boxes shouldn't be considered the be-all end-all of what is representative for instance, the professional associations and that sort of thing. It's just supposed to be a starting point for the conversations that you would then have at whatever ABC institution you're at, to then say, what does this look like for us for the tenure process, and how does that then be represented for us for our final documents and what that means. And so one of the things in our last, like the webinar that we had just last week, right? That we had a little bit of discussion about is like, how do we represent that better in this document? Is it putting a little thing in at the top of each of these and say, like, just say EG and the list to make it clear that this is just a representative list? Do we put in language that says ideas such as, and then give you the list? Do we remove the table entirely and do something else? I mean, if any of you have a better idea of how to represent this more clearly, we are all ears, because we don't want this to be, again, anything that indicates that this is a prescriptive list and this represents everything and anything to do with the categories that we have supplied.
Couldn't you just change your heading at the top and say examples of?
Yeah, it could be as simple as
Right.
doing that, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, anything that seems to make it clearer to everyone,
Right.
we are more than willing to make that change.
Because I think as much as you want this to be sort of suggested examples, unless you state it in paragraph form and repeat it at the top of every page, people will take it as a prescriptive list.
So the comment was that we could add some language so that people wouldn't misunderstand this framework as a prescriptive list. We do have that under recommended use on the first page, but it keeps coming up. So adding it to every single page is maybe a good idea. Thank you.
It's everywhere. I'm always happy to pepper you all with questions. One of the other suggestions that came out of last week's webinar was the idea of adding case uses to this document to help guide people from suggested framework, not prescriptive framework, toward implementation. Do you see that being helpful? This is how you can start to combine some of these categories for changing guidelines, for making a case to an administrator, for an individual promotion process, whatever case use you would like to envision. Is that helpful or a waste of time?
You're thinking like a toolkit that you put with this?
I think what I'm envisioning is just maybe like 3 or 4 like literal
Okay.
case uses. Like here's your case, here's how to take this framework and apply it to that case use. I don't know if we have time to develop a whole interactive toolkit.
Do you mean almost like
We have a time deadline.
An example.
Someone's got a baby on the way. She's our timeline.
do you mean like a sample CV that sort of says, here's just a list of citations and how they would fit into something like that?
That could be a possible case use, yeah. I don't know if we'd go that granular, but in a file for promotion, X person has given this presentation, these are the metrics that they employ to document said presentation. To get too meta, but there were 16 attendees at this one, etc.
Sure.
I hear one sure. Do I hear 2? Okay. Any pushback against that, I suppose? And would it help get away from the prescriptive nature to include those?
I think especially if you included more than one.
If we include more than one, especially.
Or if you included things that were not in your table.
If we include things that are not in the table.
Right. To
Can you give
show-
some examples?
Like the
No.
consortium one. Well, you could do like the consortium one or the
Consortium
Sigrid.
Right.
leadership, yeah.
Yeah.
Social leadership. Okay.
Weird things like vendor product advisory board, that's
Yeah.
a weird niche I've
Vendor
got
product
to.
advisory board, yes.
Yeah.
That's on here.
Yeah.
I feel like I tried to include that because I'm on one.
Yeah.
But I don't remember if it's in here. So maybe some of the less common, weirder ways in which our professional service and contributions crop up.
Right.
Why would that be scholarship and not service?
Question, why is it scholarship and not service? So we tried to be as inclusive as possible, and different libraries handle that very differently. Professional contributions are sometimes a combined field, but yeah, definitely there are always people that look at this and say, that's not scholarship, and that's okay. It's defined by your institution more than by us.
It
But
might, I don't know, you
yeah.
might kind of just take those pieces and separate them for people that do incorporate professional service into their scholarship or primary job. Some people treat it as primary job too.
Yep, suggestion to take it out and separate it.
Just
My
as-
worry is that I don't know where we would separate it because different institutions draw the line different places. And that's just from having looked at the types of outputs and the categories that they're listed under at different institutions that at least I have not seen a hard and fast line of what people, where it stops being scholarship and where it starts being professional service.
And for my own case, like it depended on what kind of service. When I served on the program planning committee, I counted that as scholarship. When I served as the webmaster for an association, that was kind of service, professional service.
Yeah.
I'm gonna comment that within one person, we've counted within multiple categories just depending on the nature of what you did.
I think that is so true because we don't count reviews, book reviews or reviews that you do for journals, peer review. We count that as service. So it's very different at institution. Even at teaching, we count that as service. And even if you I taught a class, a credit course, that's still counted as service.
So the comments are each institution may consider different activities, service or scholarship, depending on the institution or even depending on the scholar's choice of where to list it in their CV. So that it's hard to separate out in the framework.
Probably you already introduced it. I'm kind of interested in why their task force has been formed. Like, did you say, did you get any like requests or some problems from other institutions have the problem of come up with a framework?
the question was, why did we make this in the first place? The answer is because I wanted to, honestly. Part of it, and just to tell my own personal story of how I became interested in this, I ran a podcast for academic librarians for 3 years and really struggled to convince other librarians that this was a form of impact in our profession, that it wasn't peer reviewed, but we had a lot of subscribers and people would blog about it and post it as like supplementary material for classes being taught, things like that. But it got me interested in why do we consider peer review to be the end all and be all, and changing minds about how we communicate ideas in our profession. Especially as scholarly communication changes so rapidly, is kind of the basis of why I started thinking about this and trying to document my own impact. And most of my scholarship is informed by metrics and looking at how few guidelines there are for things that are not traditional impact measures, citation-based, and thinking, well, I can't do anything about all of it, but at least we can start somewhere, of trying to think of a better way to support each other, especially because we are such an unusual, in my opinion, field. As we're learning, the lines between service and scholarship are very blurred. So no one asked me to do this, but I convinced people that it was a good idea to start wrestling with. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think we may be at an end if there are no more burning feedback, questions, etc. And I would like to thank you guys all for coming. Getting this feedback is really, really important to make sure that we end up with a document that will actually, not to be too meta, impact our profession and impact you guys in some meaningful and positive way. So if you guys think of anything, now or in the future, these are just so you can get back to the framework, today's slides. That's the one that I promised with more of our background findings is that third link. I am told that this presentation and the slides will be available on the Charleston website, and that's all the specificity that was given to me. So if you're seeing this online, it worked. But we would love to hear from you. If, in a day, in a week, you find yourself still thinking about this and having thoughts, please do get in touch. Not that I put any of our contact information on here, but I believe our contact information should be on, it'll be in the schedule on the Charleston planner. So, thank you.
Yeah.